then they actively disengage from that process of consulting or being consulted by state-led entities. So these co-opting modes of engagement, we can go to the next slide. Then this research took me to Nairobi, where I was interested to notice or document and valorize this very similar mode of organizing or being collective within the city, where the clear difference of is in the logic of organization from Addis to Nairobi, where you have in Addis this funerary organization transforming into a city maintaining or city an entity that provides urban service, to where in Nairobi where you have people organized because of the lack of urban services, and then they transform into social functions where you collect money for somebody who's sick or somebody who's died or somebody who wants to celebrate a wedding or something like that. So the cases you see are the Muthaiga Residents Association, which is in a quite a middle-class neighborhood. Austin's Grounds is in one of the slums in Nairobi, and the Mathare Social Justice Center, also located in one of the slums of Nairobi. So coming from an academic background, then I try to make this information available in very different means and very different ways, and this is the first iteration that you see. We can go to the next slide. So within this context, within the perspective of Addis, Addis is transforming because there is this liberalization project, economic liberalization project that is happening, and I want to maybe read a bit of an excerpt if I'm not pushing it on time. I will read the premise or the introduction of this project. The new flower has bloomed in grey this year. A huge undertaking overseen by the city government of Addis is changing the very fabric of living in a city. Arada, Kasantris, Sarit, Urail, Gurchola, and many more have become close to unrecognizable. We artists, researchers, and architects foregrounding the question of a sense of home in our Addis Ababa are torn between our memories of the city we draw inspiration from and the inevitable reality of change. In such context, we try to understand how we engage with processes that sweep reality from beneath our feet. So this project, Beit, meaning home, also from the Arabic word Beit. Also while working on this project, we noticed that there is no distinction in the Amharic language Beit between a home and a house, which sort of circles us back to the previous conversation of what does a home mean? Is it just the material structure, or is it all of the processes, all of the community, and all of the intangibles that are involved or attached to a home? So what we study here is before these spaces disappear, what are the intangibles? What are the pieces, the material, all of these things that make a home, that the collectivization that attach us to a space or that make us inhabit as opposed to settling. So inspired by Ola's question of where do people go, with this project we try to inquire where are people physically being uprooted to, and how are these dislocations or movements affecting our understanding of a home. Yes, I think that's the final slide. Thank
you. Thank you so much, Yasmin, for your compelling work and also taking the time to document such an essential part of our cities, you know, which sometimes, I think, particularly in our field or in studying architecture, depending on the type of canons that we have, there's a sort of kind of predisposition to maybe not consider certain things to be valid to the discourse of, you know, whether it's architecture or urban planning or how we think about cities. So to really center such an important kind of community structure through the work and documenting it and understanding how it operates at various levels is really important. And we're going to continue talking about the relevance of this type of approach to how we view our cities after we give the floor to Aisha. Aisha Mugo, saying it Mogo, okay. Aisha Mogo, sorry. Who is a Somali-Kenyan analog film photographer who embodies the dual role of artist and cultural geography and urbanism scholar working from Nairobi, Kenya. With a Bachelor of Science in Geology and Environmental and Geographical Science, an honors degree in environmental science specializing in global south urbanism and migration from the University of Cape Town, and a Master of Science in Urban Studies from Malmö University, Sweden. She bridges academic rigor and artistic practice to explore identity, memory, and urbanity. Her artistic and research journey has been an unwavering complement to generating and contributing novel forms of archival practices and new geographies. Her work is a borderless map where she marks the self, contributing to a visual understanding of African identity. Aisha has had her photographic essay, Sisi Nani, Who Are We?, published in the South African research journal BUA in 2019, and she has exhibited in Nairobi Design Week in 2020. She was also a finalist of Authority Collective inaugural list, Photographers to Watch in 2019, and participated in the group exhibition at Photoville NYC. Aisha was a featured photographer in the International Center for Photography in New York installment IP projected Emerging Analog in 2021, an exhibition created by Kodak, and most recently, as a contributing member of the collective Matrix Architecture, she co-produced and co-authored Home Place, a love letter in 2023, an installation commissioned by the Pinakothek der Moderne in Munich, reflecting on Afro-diasporic experiences in the concept of home. And lastly, Aisha is a research at the Mawazo Institute. Thank you for being here, Aisha.
Thank you. You're probably a bit old school and nervous, so I prefer to stand. So basically I'll start with the title, What Happens to the Stories That Are Not Told? Where Do They Go? Analog film photography as a means of spatial storytelling and archiving the city. First slide, please. So I'll start with a personal anecdote. The image to the right, featuring my paternal grandparents and great aunts, holds profound historical and personal significance, offering a lens into the layered complexities of resistance, migration, and identity that underpin a lot of my research and artistic practice. This photograph was taken during the Mau Mau emergency of 1952 to 1960. A very pivotal moment in anti-colonial struggle against British colonial rule in Kenya. My grandmother, to the right, was a nurse in these colonial hospitals, and she was deeply impacted by the atrocities she witnessed, leading to her taking the Mau Mau oath 3 times. Using her position and gender as shields within the urban space that she existed, she became a vital link in the resistance, smuggling medical supplies and food. She navigated these colonial spaces with remarkable ingenuity and courage, therefore bridging her dual role as freedom fighter but also as caregiver. My maternal grandfather, the one further right, was a Somali immigrant around the same time, and he fled from the town of Buko in today's Somaliland. Fleeing Italian-occupied Somalia in his late teens, he journeyed to Kenya in search of refuge and opportunity. Along the way, he sustained himself by working in urban centers along the way, such as Mogadishu and Kismayo, as well as Mandera in Kenya. And eventually he did settle in Kenya during the tumultuous years of the Mau Mau revolt. As a cowhide dealer, he forged his path in a foreign land amidst colonial conflict. This photograph is the only visual record we have of him. These familiar narratives and the archive of their images form the backbone of my research and artistic practice. They reveal the intimate connections between memory, migration, marginalization, and resistance, while underscoring the critical role of archival photographs in reclaiming histories. Photography becomes a medium through which the personal and the collective are reimagined, archived, and embodied. In this work, I not only honor their legacy by weaving visual storytelling with urban and cultural geographies. These family photographs are not just relics of the past, but also active tools in the creation of new geographies of memory and identity. Next slide, please. With this in mind, my practice revolves around the inter-tapestry that is urban life, posing questions such as what traces of urban life are there in the city? Who has the right to remember? Who has the right to a city? What images of the city do we remember, and how do we remember? The explicit use of 35mm film contributes towards building this repository of collective memory through a mastery of a tool that was once used against African subjugation, and regaining the ownership of image making and of subverting the once oppressive instrument. In alignment with what Bell Hooks says, and claims that we're in conventional, even stereotypical modes of representing Blackness, often receive the greatest reward, my practice endeavors to challenge established norms of urban realities, developing new ways of reimagining and representing African urban spatiotemporal journeys. Next slide, please. I speak of my research artistic practice as one rooted in vulnerability as methodology, a deliberate and conscious approach of engaging with others, spaces, and histories. This methodology acknowledges vulnerability not as a weakness, but as a transformative tool that fosters deeper connection and trust. It is an understanding that, as a collector of stories and memories, I am also an active participant in this exchange. This process requires me to approach the work with a porous openness, ready to give as much as I receive, creating an equitable flow of knowledge, emotion, and narrative. In practice, this means embracing the emotional weight of the stories I collect and honoring the trust placed in me by collaborators, participants, and even the spaces themselves. It is an intimate process where personal histories and shared moments unfold through active listening and the creation of safe spaces for storytelling. Vulnerability as a methodology allows for critical self-reflection, ensuring that the act of harvesting stories is never extractive or one-sided, but reciprocal and ethical. It guides the design of installations and archives that hold these stories with care, offering spaces of empathy, shared humanity, and critical inquiry. By welcoming vulnerability into the process, I create the conditions for meaningful connections, ultimately reframing storytelling and research as collaborative acts of resistance and reimagination. Next slide, please. So this is just a very brief sample of one of the projects that I have undertaken. So the images on the screen are selected from the What Hope Gave to Me portraiture series, which I undertook in Cape Town, South Africa, which was an exploration of hypervisibility of migrant women within the construction of home. Photographs, and in this case portraiture, is a significant tool to counter stereotypes, particularly of the stereotypes that people hold of migrant, immigrant, and refugee women within the urban landscape. Again, taking from Bell Hooks, who says access and mass appeal have historically made photography a powerful location for the construction and oppositional aesthetic. So in this project, I asked each of the women to bring an object or a garment that reminded them of home. Their positionality as women, but particularly young women, young immigrant and refugee women within the urban space, has often rendered them invisible in migration and urban literature, to which Kenyan migration scholar Caroline Kihato says, inaudible voices, invisible bodies. And yet women are often integral to our understanding of home. Though this work sought to collapse binary conceptual frames that often depict women as either a victor or a victim in the migration process, but hope to provide a deep understanding of everyday socio-political encounters. Next slide, please. With this in mind, imagery has the power to also inform design and how we can begin to honor collective memory. As part of the collective Maitri architecture, we came together to reimagine and reconfigure the rotunda of the Pinakothek de Moderna. According to American scholar Ashton Crawley, the term otherwise means, otherwise is a word that names plurality as its core operation. Otherwise speaks of the ongoingness of possibility, of things existing other than what is given, what is known, what is grasped. When we speak of practicing otherwise, we engage with modes of storytelling that take imaginary to image and image to imaginary. We're working with recovering and discovering spatialities for ungraspable social things that are considered non-spatial, because up until now, they have not been expressed or privileged in architectural history. Next slide, please. Forgive me, I really do like bell hooks, so I will quote bell hooks again. The title of this exhibition took inspiration from bell hooks' influential essay, Home Place, A Site of Resistance. As defined by Hooks' insightful perspective, the home place transcends mere geography. It symbolizes a deeply rooted, emotionally charged space that recognizes the importance of a safe, nurturing space where Black people, especially Black women, can find rest and respite from various forms of marginalization and discrimination. The frameworks and vocabularies bell hooks constructs helps us to account for and address our complex and intersecting relationships to power and privilege, visioning the home as a place of active resistance to social harms and the creation of fellowship and commune as a means of loving social connections. It contributes to the critical discourse of African and Black migration, liberation, and celebration. Therefore, in this conceptualization, we drew inspiration from the curtain, a subtle yet profound archetype found across African homes and the diaspora. This light and nearly imperceptible divider carries deep significance, effectively shaping spaces while embodying the fluidity of movement and connection. As 5 members from the collective, spanning from South Africa to Togo, Cabinda to Kenya and Suriname, it evoked memories of bodies gently moving through these delicate thresholds. So when we're in the initial process of curating this exhibition, we reflected deeply on where we come from, what sustains us, and who breathes life into our existence. The concept of home emerged as a pertinent and unifying thread, a place of gathering where stories, rituals, belonging, and return converge. As we explored this theme, the act of dwelling revealed itself as a profound resonance, prompting us to ask what unfolds within the intimate spaces of the African home. Our homes are rich in aromas, melodies, and rhythms, encapsulate far more than physical structures. For all we may materially lack, it is the abundance of community, connection, and shared rituals that fills these spaces with meaning and vitality. Next slide, please. So the image to the top left is an early depiction of my grandmother's house from memory, where the curtains partition various sections of the home. So in a traditional Somali house, that the deeper you get into the house, the more intimate it becomes, the heavier the curtain. So these curtains closely resemble those captured in the previous slide, taken during an Eid celebration in a family member's home. The beaded curtain, blending cherished everyday objects, which we can see on this side, such as a fufu stomper and an afro comb, symbolize the unifying power of daily rituals and the creation of new meaningful wholes. It demonstrates how the things we carry, both tangible and intangible, become integral to constructing and reaffirming our sense of belonging. Across time and space, these objects and memories anchor us to our whole place, embodying the intimate interplay of personal and shared histories. Last slide, please. So in conclusion, spatial storytelling invites us to move beyond purely rational frameworks and conventional methodologies for researching urban spaces, embracing a practice that centers connection with those who are often ignored or marginalized. It allows for a reimagining of how we understand our cities, not through abstract notions of what places mean, but through a sensory focus on how things looked, how they felt, how they sounded, in the lived experiences of their inhabitants. Incorporating narratives into urban planning requires not only listening, but also offering parts of your own story, fostering a reciprocal exchange that deepens our understanding of spatiotemporal relationships. This practice challenges the exclusionary tendencies of urban deliberations, which often overlook or marginalize the voices of artisans, urban farmers, taxi drivers, migrant entrepreneurs, and informal workers. These individuals are not just the majority of users of urban space, but are also key agents in reshaping their form and function. By letting the stories guide us, we unlock new insights and understandings that might otherwise remain obscured in traditional urban and spatial planning frameworks. This approach centers people as the protagonists of their own urban narratives, honoring their agency and contributions while broadening the scope of how we study and how we engage with the city. In the end, spatial storytelling is not simply a tool for analysis, but a practice of recognition and reimagination. It reminds us that the stories that we encounter and the stories that we share collectively have the power to challenge dominant paradigms and foster empathy within us as urban dwellers and transform how we see and shape urban spaces. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha, and for keeping in the time. Got to appreciate that. No, thanks for this, again, very compelling presentation. I'm linking many of the questions I think posed previously by Yasmin and Ola, which we'll also get to, which you sort of touched on, is the difference between a house and a home, right? Which even the word is the same thing. Fundamentally, though, they do evoke different things. You can have a house that is not a home, right? And you can have a home that is not a house, ultimately. But really highlighting, I think, even through the exhibition that you all worked on, the matriarchy, is really investigating, again, this common thread and common objects found in so many homes, in so many geographies as well. When I looked at it, I was thinking of what you see in a lot of Caribbean homes. It's this kind of like kernel curtain that I think is also there, that it acts as a threshold, so when you cross it, it also notifies people that somebody has come into sound. So finding all this kind of, again, understanding through the speciality, these objects are also there to kind of mark the way in which we relate to each other, to indicate degrees of intimacy, to define space, etc. And it was really compelling examples, which also made me realize, as you were talking about and showing the portraiture of refugees, it made me think about the question that Yasmin or Ola posed, which is, where do people go? And made me think about what do people take with them when they go, especially in the context of, I think, forced any type of migration. You reflected so much on your own family history with migration that was, chosen, not chosen, but what they took with them and what they also transmitted, I'm sure, through you, is really, I think, fundamental to also realizing that, as Germaine Akumi said this morning, we are like snails. We do move with, our bodies, sometimes our homes as well, within us. I want to give, so Ola couldn't be here with us today. She's on her way. But I wanted to take the opportunity to maybe read one of her abstracts. And we'll get, I think, the chance to she'll get a chance to, I think, address the public in person in the coming days, but just given that so much of her contribution mattered as well to this conversation, I'm going to take the time to just read abstract, and then from then on we'll start the conversation. Once I find it, give me a second. Let's just hope. Found it. Her abstract is entitled Where Do People Go? As we look at the debris of modernity and the many creative regimes we have inherited, as populations, we are managing the ecological catastrophes directly linked to the emergence of the impacts of imperialism. What can we observe in our environment, built or otherwise, that has deferred the pursuit of the impact of the ecological void to the contemporary era, and how has this condition changed our material world? Artist and architect by training, a score of what has been done, Ola's practice stems from the role of the observer, a role that commonly emerged at the heart of communities living within agricultural programs set up as part of the imperial projects in Sudan. A watcher sits attentively for a period of time with the elements of the land, namely water, to monitor the debris. The observer is a companion listening and understanding environmental changes and passing this information to the relevant parties. Watching for debris is therefore a strategy for maintaining our environment in this material condition of cyclical disasters. Ola sees this role as one of work and repair in the face of impending disasters, man-made or otherwise, which deliver decomposed parts of remnants from elsewhere, and then resonate with the observer as markers of preparation, reconstruction, strategy, and ultimately change. In this symposium, she proposes a kind of observation informed by the disembodied territory left without material by the disaster, the stories of those who are in constant state of arrival after having been displaced. Observation confers a form of agency and a tool for ratifying the way in which we can cultivate political awareness for the future and inhabit space in a way that does not expel anyone. Her objective is to talk about the potential of observation, what it can do in the boom of African cities today. Our built forms have problematized our conventional spatial practices and carry on a kind of state of permanence. If carefully observed, permanence no longer has substance and generates other debris of modernity. In Ola's work, this debris is considered not as mere representations, but as a tangible medium that can be seen, desired, discarded, or even rescued through the cyclicality of catastrophe, simply by looking at an architecture that restores value, and particularly to communities. In this context, Ola proposes the act of looking in the wake of the sequence of sites that have suffered the disasters and analyzing the question of what we see when we look around us. So it couldn't be, I think, a better sort of follow-up to Aisha, your presentation when you were talking about spatial storytelling. And the other thing that I felt that Ola expressed really well, even in our previous conversation, is that when we look at space and cities, and we've spoken a little bit earlier today about the question of memory, she shared a frustration that she has with a lot of the documentation of, let's say, modernist architecture that sort of glorifies the object and doesn't center enough the human experience attached to those objects or attached to those buildings. I wonder if any one of you wants to comment or respond to some of her questions and prompts.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think one of the main things I also attempt to address with the work that I do is this objectification of people and places. And I think it's also something we discussed over lunch today of how, as architects, well, urban planners and urbanists such as myself, unfortunately, academia can kind of prepare you to be an objectifier when it comes to the spaces that you inhabit and understanding the patterns of urban space. So I think it's trying to think about what can we do with the urban skill sets and the urban tools that we have. And I think we also discussed the theories. Do we do the theory first and then do we put it down, or do we look at the situation and use the theories that we understand to look at urban space? But I think it's also about individual practice, and actually ultimately praxis as well. So ultimately I think it's that objectification of people and places, and how can we begin to bring that humanity back to both the human and the space that exists as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that in terms of saying, especially when you, let's say indigenous architecture, when you speak of those spaces, if you don't speak of the people or the culture, then you don't speak of the architecture or the way people organize, the way people organize within the city, right? So that departure or that deviation of where culture goes and where the object goes is where the fault line is, in my opinion. And I think as an architect, sort of trying to understand that context becomes fundamental to what you propose then in the future, that you are conscious of this context, you're situated in this particular space. Then by saying that whoever you produce for or how you occupy that space is fundamentally informed by the practices, the rituals, the forms of care work that Ola was mentioning.
No, thank you for that. I am going to pivot a little bit to trying to maybe expand, as we were talking about practice, our understanding of what constitutes an archive or form of, let's say, human archive in the context of the city, of the human experience or the living experience. And why do you think, maybe you, Aisha, at first, like, why do you think it's important to document it?
Forgive me, I may not get this quote directly correct. Please, architects, urban planners, don't kill me. But I think it's Michel de Certeau who speaks on the everyday practices, and I think he kind of speaks to the adage that we're all archives. We're all living, breathing archives, just like the city is a living, breathing entity. And I will speak particularly to the Kenyan context. 2024 showed us flames in Kenya a little bit in regards to protest and the current government that is in place. I don't think we can speak of the city. I cannot speak of Nairobi without speaking of the tensions that exist. And there is this also another saying by a Kenyan writer called Yvonne Adhiambo, who says that Kenyans speak 3 languages: English, Swahili, and silence. And I focus a lot on the archive because I always wanted to be about the rejection of this narrative of silence. Perhaps the politicians are louder than the people, I might say that. But Kenyans have constantly been resisting in urban space, have constantly been developing archives of resistance. And I think the image I showed of my grandparents, that was taken at the height of the emergency, 1956. So there has always been movements of developing the archives and this form of storytelling. And during the protests, the called Maandamano protests in Kenya in June, where 60 young people lost their lives fighting for a better Kenya, and those 60 are the ones that we know of. Immediately after, there was this clarion call for like archiving. If you have a whistle, if you have a poster, if you have photographs, to kind of build this repository of memory, because we have been living in a city that has forced us to forget. Unfortunately, we have state-sanctioned silence and violence. So there's this constant clarion call to archive and to remember and to not forget. So contributing towards this is trying to build on this repository of the everyday. And the everyday can also be mundane. And I think that's a very important part. The everyday is the mundane. The everyday is loss, it's celebration, it's life, it's maybe nothing at all. So I would say why, for me particularly, that's why the archive is extremely, extremely important, especially when there is active attempts of state-sanctioned erasure?
Yeah, I think I would say one of the major achievements of the colonial project is to get rid of the archive, and not only in terms of material. Once you lose the material, then you lose the memory as well. And I think then what you have in terms of a sense of place or a sense of self or a sense of home itself that is completely erased, then you become you become non-place or non-aware, or I think.
It's interesting that you brought up the sort of erasure as well as a kind of very intentional tool to, I think, what do you call it? I think make certain populations vulnerable. In a lot of the work that we do here in Dakar, particularly with Carol on questions of heritage and the exhibition that we did at Raw Material, it's not always easy to genuinely justify why an effort to try to even care about any type of urban heritage matters to many people. Some of us are accused of being, romantics and missing the past, or, being kind of, nostalgic of even the colonial era, particularly when it comes to, let's say, buildings. But I've always felt that, and then also witnessing a lot of, demolition and erasure and just loss of various forms of archives within the city, including some living things like trees and places that hold spiritual, meanings to people. It always felt like not a people or a community that doesn't really have any kind of anchorage in its, like I would say, collective memory. When you erase that, you sort of create, I think, a void and a gap that is an invitation or an opportunity to fill. Often, it's filled with, let's say, new construction project, which we forget, because although construction tends to be very much sold as something that is for the people. I mean, when you were showing that kind of idea of like the new ADES and all the infrastructure, etc., like governments always have to sort of sell it and say, look, we're doing this for the people, but never really highlighting at which cost you sort of, doing so. Because Senami was talking about the software of capitalism and liberalism that we sort of operate in. It's always serving a certain interest. The expense and what is being lost in the process is never really valued. And it brings me to actually ask kind of a couple of things. Number one, I think maybe reflect as well on the fact that a lot of the histories of violence, as you pointed out, are often linked not just to colonial history, but tend to happen in places that have been places of liberations. I've always found very odd that in a lot of history of stories that I hear coming from protests in Kenya, protests in Ghana, even protests here in Senegal, a lot of the, let's say, repression of kind of civic protests tend to happen in places that are independence squares, Place de la Nation, always things that are the square of the people, often linked with the history of liberation, but now kind of being enacted as also sites of repression. So there's a certain, I think, kind of echo to a form of history which kind of shows that there's a certain continuity, maybe of like certain processes of the state, but I think it's important to just really center that understanding, that knowledge of history, and question whether all of that infrastructure at the end is serving the people. Because I think a lot of the tension and the reasons why we're also having this conversation is that there's often, again, a gap, as you explained, Yasmin, between what the state is meant to provide, that void, and how the people fill it, but yet the state, in principle, having to operate for the people. So I guess maybe my question to you is that, what does that do then to the people that are aware of those gaps, of that kind of violence, of that kind of disregard? What does that do to the relationship that they create, that they have with the state, that they have as a community? yes, and the idea of citizenship ultimately.
When those two images I saw of the bulldozers kind of digging at one of the major rivers, when that project started within our city in Agdes, my sister and I, we used to talk about, okay, why are we not protesting? Or where are the people who have been removed and why are they not saying anything? And I think eventually when that project kind of evolved into phase 2 and phase 3, then we sort of understood, okay, we have this position, we understand or somewhat understand or are aware of the processes of erasure and violence that are happening, then we have to take a position of protest. And what does that mean to protest within the practice of architecture or within the practice of urbanism? Then I think that's where our role comes, but also in terms of the communities that we were speaking of, being collective, being brought within this circle of doing things together, making things happen, that sort of creates a spirit of changing things, I would say. And I think people seek for those spaces and lean towards or gravitate towards those areas because then they understand there's something wrong with the processes that are happening, and we need to collectively work towards whatever it is. Even if I don't understand it, then at least I see value in being with others who think like me. And I think in terms of, yes, that's when the question of being a citizen can be defined. Then are you an idle bystander that sort of accepts all of these processes of violence and dislocation and evictions? Or are you, in very small ways, trying to change some particulars within your space? And how does that in the future transform being collective? Where does that take you? Where does that line of thought take you in terms of saying, okay, I can negotiate my position because I am particularly working towards managing a heritage or making a public space or managing the waste within this neighborhood that was or should be an urban service because I pay my tax. So then I think, yes, it gives you a particular position that you can actually negotiate. We'll see in the future if that happens or not, but at least there is a spirit of understanding or hope that comes with that realization.
Thank you. Before I open to the public, I just want to give Aisha the opportunity to reflect, I think, on the question of citizenship and ultimately who has the right to the city and what defines somebody's sort of right to the city.
Thank you. Actually, I just follow up what you said. And I think citizenship is always contested, right? You can belong to a space, but what are your democratic rights? What are your socioeconomic rights when it comes to citizenship? And particularly because citizenship is only granted to those who have access, right? What does citizenship mean to you when you are relegated to the urban periphery, to the fringes of society, that is queer bodies, migrant bodies, women as well, often constantly relegated to the fringes of urban society. So what does citizenship mean to us, right? Who defines citizenship? Because in urban scholarship, there's a lot of discussion of citizenship being democratic. You have your rights, you can vote. But what does democratic rights mean when socioeconomically within urban space I am nothing? What does that mean if I do not have access to running water? If I do not have access to sanitation? If I am living on less than, at least for Kenya, less than $1, right? I don't even think that's very, very old stat. I'm sure it's even worse now with the inflation. So I think citizenships constantly need to be contested. We cannot become apathetic, and I think with Kenya, particularly those who are urban dwellers, there's a burgeoning middle class apathy. And I think with the protests that happened in June, this kind of brought a bit of a shockwave through the country because those who are fighting for a better Kenya tend to be those who are willing to put their bodies on the line because they are the urban periphery, right? They are not those who have stable jobs, who are okay sitting in Nairobi traffic, which, if you've heard, is probably some of the worst traffic on the continent. They're not those people. So I constantly struggle to grapple with citizenship. I think depending on your positionality and the intersections of your identity, you will see and you will live citizenship differently, right? But I think to kind of like build on what Yasmin has kind of said, what does collectivization in urban spaces look like? I think what is your role in this collectivization of dismantling citizenship that is more inclusive to all? And I think once we start to, and we also start to look at it from the lower levels, for example, like the Mathare Social Justice Center that Yasmin presented, initially started as a justice center where women in slums, where their sons were being killed through extrajudicial killings or forced disappearances, and they came together to demand justice. And Mathare Social Justice Center now is huge. There's eco-justice that is involved now. It's also part of unionization of domestic workers as well. And this has completely removed the government. It has completely subverted clientelism or patronage. And therefore they can begin to do the work that they need to do individually. And these are the things we really need to support and to constantly question ourselves, but also as a collective. What does citizenship really mean to you? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. And on this note, we're going to open the questions to the public, just to continue the conversation, contributions, questions. Feel free. Oui? Micro?
Hi everybody, I'm Lupe. Thank you very much for your interventions. It was really interesting. And I was thinking about what Aisha said on, because I don't know anything about Kenya or Nairobi, so I was wondering how did it happen, this thing of the city forgetting the people and the forget. And I was wondering how would a movement of the city being thought and occupied by the people would start. I don't know if I explained myself.
On te donne la parole, Marie-Hélène.
Thank you so much for sharing all these insightful stories. I think I wanted to ask a bit about that idea of forgetting. And I'm wondering, in these cities, what are the spaces that have resisted forgetfulness? We've spoken about the question of the archive and the question of memory, and I think that, of course, we are all formatted to think about the archive in a particular manner. Yes, the colonial conquest had this mission of erasing all the archives, but there are some forms of memories of archive that resisted. And I think maybe it could be interesting to think about the sonic, think about sonic landscapes, the architecture of sound, and how much different cities have kept their memories into the sonic landscapes of the cities. If you go to Nairobi, Kinshasa, Dakar has that as well, where the sonic is a space of resistance. the sound of the birds, the sound of the Karapit in Dakar, and other places where it reminds you of the Dakar that existed and still exists today in a different form, but that remain kind of the same in the sonic.
Yeah, go ahead. Or collect.
Thank you so much for your contributions and your thoughts. I think I have no experience in urbanism, but I think everything's interconnected, so I really appreciated your points. And I just wanted to ask, in terms of the digital space and the role of archiving in the digital world, especially in the context of protests, how you feel about that as a new form of archiving, but also the role of erasure within digital protests. For example, with internet shutdowns or censorship, and how you think this plays into this whole dynamic.
Should we try to answer the first batch, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah? It's going to get to a lot. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So that, choice first.
I think both your questions are kind of interlinked, so I think, forgive me, I might just speak a bit generally. Thank you so much for speaking on sound. And for one, in Nairobi, there's Sound of Nairobi, SON, and it is a digital archive that collects soundscapes from all over the city, whether this is, our public transport is called Matatu. So whether this is a Matatu stop, even though they stop everywhere, they don't stop always at where they're supposed to. This is in markets. This has been archived as well within the CBD. So there is a building repository of sound. But actually, in part of my notes last night when we were thinking about this, I had an experience with a whistle. And this kind of has opened up my mind a bit more beyond imagery, where in the protest, I went to one of the protests, and there was a young man just handing out whistles. To anybody who wanted one, you could get a whistle. And amidst the tear gas, amidst the batons, he kept on handing out tear gas. Sorry, whistles. Apologies. And after that, I just kept thinking to myself about sound. With how we forget, or how we remember, what does sound mean to me now? What does the sound of a whistle mean within this spatial urban context that I'm dealing with? Because now, before protests and understanding of sound, a whistle was a whistle in a football game, right? But now a whistle has taken this new identity. And for me, this is where I start to feel like the urban youth, particularly in Kenya, are no longer docile, or are not docile. Right, and that whistle signified to me that this is not silence. There might not be words attached, but this is a rejection. The whistle was really a symbolism of a rejection to this adage that Kenyans forget, or Kenyans are docile people, or Kenyans are the angels of East Africa, wow, the usual, right? Kenya is democratic, it works. And I think that to me presented a new ways to think about the archive. What does sound look like to us now? Because also the whistle was a tool used during the concentration camps, the British colonial time, and there were concentration camps, and the whistle was used to get people into line. So what is this subversion that has come on our 61st, because Kenya turned 61 this year? What does that mean on our 61st anniversary, right? How are we subverting all these tools that were used for subjugation? First, how are we reclaiming, but also how are we utilizing them to continue to push back on the regimes that are in power? And what are the spaces that, the city forgetting. So I think when it comes to in Kenya we say Kenyanisms, and forgetfulness is a Kenyanism. And I think it very much stems from the colonial project of how you're kind of this conditioning to do and to not ask. So when you don't ask, you cannot question. So you are forced to forget, right? So this has kind of been, and I think also because there have been ethnic valorizations within Kenya that are influenced by the political elite. So again, because Kenya is made to seem like this perfect angel, that you cannot speak of the tensions because democracy is more important, because stability is more important, because you have to be prosperous. You're Kenya, you're too big to fail. Because you're too big to fail, you cannot speak up. So this forgetfulness and the atrocities of colonialism, for example, that story of my grandmother only revealed it on her deathbed. Nobody knew. Because it was more important that we move forward, we forget to survive. And how can the people begin to occupy? You know, again, it's right now, neoliberalism has really taken a foothold in urban space. Just like Nzinga had mentioned, places of collectivization, of protest have now been taken away. For example, we had Uhuru Park. Uhuru means independence in Swahili. It has now been sold off to a private partner. What does that mean? A nightclub, probably, and a bar, and something like that. So what does that mean for us and our ability to collectivize and to protest when, you know, these are spaces that have been specifically constructed for people to meet, to gather, to sleep, to lounge, you know, to flaneur, to walk around and do what they need to do, have been taken away from us. But the digital space has been very important because Twitter Spaces is where people collectivized. Very, very hard. But then, of course, that also comes with economic ramifications because not everybody is on Twitter. But that does not mean that people are not collectivizing in their homes. People are collectivizing in, for example, Mother Social Justice. People are constantly collectivizing where they need to do the work. And I'll stop there.
I just wanted to address the question of forgetfulness, also in saying, in the context of Ethiopia, Addis being a private city, everything, the disadvantage of that is something that happens in Addis happens like in a third tier city or like a, you know, if a space is named Piazza, Piazza is one of the largest avenues in the city. There, in all of at least 10 cities, there are places named Piazza. So even though that's a nightmare in terms of planning and in terms of urban design, it's a form of resisting when there's this new know-it-all government that has a lot of finances that's erasing the very essence of Piazza and Cassanchis. Then you have all of these other places that were trying to replicate what was happening in Piazza and Addis, and that's a form of resistance. I also wanted to speak about the sonic experience and the sonic tradition in terms of saying it's not always, I guess you can argue, the hegemony of knowledge and AI and all of that is a form of colonization as well, and that you can also argue the oral tradition is the one form of knowledge production and knowledge replication and transmission that AI cannot access. And I think existing within the oral space, within resistances that use the method or the mode of oral knowledge production and reproduction are a form of resistance and a form of otherwise.
Thank you everyone for your contributions. I have a question that I actually wrote it down because many thoughts brought it to one context. So right now I think we see modernization across the global south. I mean, for several decades now, quote unquote modernization, where a lot of the time you have people trying to emulate the Western model, unfortunately. And in that process, I see that as a betrayal of our own people as well, where we go further and further into disparity and gaps in terms of, we look at the communities that are left behind in our modernization that often cares more for luxury, for power, for exclusive spaces, And unfortunately, as a result of the things that happened in the 70s and the 60s on the continent, we've lost a lot of radical, revolutionary ideas about how we can move forward in this world. And I've been particularly angry looking at how Rwanda, among other countries, behaves, for example, and how they just recently hosted the FIA, which is the governing body of the Formula One and Formula E tournaments, and that they hosted that in Rwanda. And I have Rwandan people in my life who shared that on their stories, and that's how I found out about it. And for me, this is just a massive, massive, massive disappointment, again, of just where are we going and can we please wake up? So now my question is, how do we imagine and achieve a modernization that does not betray our own people? Specifically, in the context of also public space. We live in Dakar, where public space doesn't really exist, and that's why so many people, build and live on the streets of the city and socialize on the streets of the city. So how do we imagine this modernization without betraying people, without leaving behind? And how do we move ahead, keeping in mind what the generations that were here before us were hoping to actually see come to life, basically. So that's a long question, but I hope it kind of just, thank you.
Two more in the front. Yes.
I have a micro, it works. I mean, more than a question, I think I have a comment. And what I want to speak to is this idea that has been spoken about forgetting and archiving memory work. Because I think we have to pay attention not to look at these things in a too black and white thing. These are very complex processes, to do memory work, and especially when communities are involved. And just maybe a very small comment, because you mentioned the grandmother saying on her deathbed what she had been carrying, so this means she had not forgotten. And I think this is very important, because memory work can be very violent, especially when traumatic events are repeated and repeated again, and when people are asked to repeat them again. So I think we have to think very carefully how memory work and archiving is being done, especially collectively, and how it becomes a process of healing for those who actually speak this traumatic memory. So I just wanted to inject this to make sure that we don't speak about these things in a very polarized way.
And if I may just quickly react to that, I think it's interesting that you talk about the talking, right? Especially when it comes to trauma, because whether it's actually spoken about or not, it still is within us, it's embodied. That there's a field of epigenetics that looks at that, like at the generational trauma. So either way, it's there because we are the sum also of our experiences, whether we're aware of them or not.
My question kind of ties into the last two ones. It's how do we envision the healing or the beginning of healing and what it looks like for people moved through displacement because of colonial forces and survival under capitalism? I think in this current space it might come more as harm reduction than an actual solution, but I think a lot of us don't know what that looks like, especially with not knowing what reclaiming land also looks like under the current environmental climate. Tied to what you were saying about trauma and memory work, I thought about what you said about collective spaces where people could feel understood and how you also feel understood in those spaces and that you can help, and how this oral recollection is being summoned and how can it be done in safe ways, especially for elders.
Thank you. Okay, I'll take a third one. So we have two questions. Thank you so much for the discussion. I just wanted to come back on the
forgetfulness and developing archives of resistance. And for me, coming from Cameroon, I think it's also a place where people tend to want to forget a lot or not speak up things that happen. But I think it's almost like impossible to forget when the tension is constantly present. And you spoke about developing archives of resistance, and I was really interested if you could develop on that and how, in your practice, how the people receive those archives of resistance. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. I'm going to take the opportunity to answer. Both of you. I do have, one comment on the first question, but I'll let you. Yeah, no, just I think, well, maybe a contribution to the question around that the gentleman asked about, what is, a project of modernization that does not betray our own people. Not to say that I necessarily have an answer. I do have some elements of what I think, what that could look like, but I just want to point out the difficulty, I think, in the context of the city, of sometimes having conflicting, wants, an appreciation of what is it, what does the modernity, let's say, project look like. I talk about this because we've had these conversations, I think in the context of raw material earlier this year, on heritage, and we gathered some architects. Alisa was there. There was, ceramicist that has been working a lot in and is very, attached to preserving a form of heritage in the city. But we were also confronted with, young musicians, tag graffiti artists that have a whole different reading of what is the city and what is heritage. So I only say this just to say that maybe in spaces like that, and earlier Yasmin was just talking about how delicate and how complicated it is to deal with the question of memory. I think that of the collective project is also something that has to be constructed very carefully. I think it's more of a question of intent, understanding as well where some of our ideas, images also come from, maybe making cautious decisions about whether this is what we want to embrace or not. But I'm not going to particularly sit here and just say that, the city has to be this way, has to abide by this rule, because what also makes the city is the diversity, of the communities. We've also been subjected, I think, to a lot of different forces. Some from within, a lot from outside, from different directions. So I think a time of kind of internal work and reflection is necessary, I think, to then construct and carefully choose what that kind of collective project is. My 2 cents.
I completely agree with that in saying that it's the intention that's the root, I don't want to say solution, but the direction, I would say. And are you speaking about the dignity of people, or are you trying to work towards a particular image that you think is useful or is termed as progress? And I think when we say development, it's immediately for me has like an implication of something that needs to be erased or needs to be improved, and completely erases value from what needs to change. And the ideals or the images we use to advocate for change or advocate for dignity and the way people live is where, if that makes sense.
Totally.
I think I will respond to how do people receive the archive of resistance. Yeah. So it's always very interesting because, like I mentioned, there's a lot of ethics that goes behind kind of connecting these stories and archiving them. And there is resistance within the resistance. There's always an element of safety. that is often questioned. And I think that's why with the kind of methodology of vulnerability, I lead with myself. And that tends to provide a space in which we can kind of have more conversations. And as well, it doesn't happen in a day. I get a million rejections, and which is completely understandable. And it never happens in one place. It never happens in the moment I think that it will. There are pockets of my own vulnerability that come, and there are pockets of the individual's vulnerability. And I think particularly because a lot of the, like I mentioned, the pictures that I take are on film, so I develop them and I print them. And as much as we all have cell phones, and you can all take pictures very easily, there is always wonder when they all receive a photo of themselves. And a lot of the time when, I think in one of the projects, there's a girl holding 2 photos, and that was her prized possession. And for her to be able to have her own is something that always presents a sense of wonder and engagement and a moment of reflection. So there's no one way about it. I think I'm also still very young in the practice. There's a lot to learn as well as I go about it, and always different ways in which I can start to understand the archive better and reflect on it. But yeah, it tends to be positive. It tends to be positive, but of course there is resistance as well within the resistance, I guess. I hope that answers the question. And I think there's a question: how do we envision healing as we move and harm reduction and safe ways? Again, within the Kenyan context, I think kind of exploring stories in these spaces has been redemptive in their own way. And I think particularly because I tend to work with women more, a lot of my work does tend to be gendered. And there's this sense of safety. And there's less harm knowing that you know, and I think there's also this thing, especially when I'm working with older women, of a bestowing of knowledge and a passing on of the knowledge. So I cannot say there's one fix on healing the trauma. I cannot say that I've found the way to do it by spatial storytelling, or there's a specific formula. But for the little niche pocket, I guess, that I exist in, there's peace in knowing that people are actively listening, and holding the stories with the very tender fingers that they deserve, and of course with all the ethical trimmings that come along with that as well.
All good? Any last burning questions? It is, oh my goodness. Our directors of symposiums are allowed to ask questions. Just kidding. Yes, Femi.
So it's not really a question, but I would make it in French for the translator to be involved in the conversation. So on est souvent sur la question de l'oubli, et je voulais juste ajouter que les sociétés se fondent sur le couple mémoire et oubli, les deux. On a un biais archivistique, le passé. Les sociétés ont besoin d'oublier, elles ont besoin de se guérir des fois, et elles ont besoin aussi de laisser de la place pour la créativité. Donc en fait, je voulais juste dire que ce n'est pas forcément une mauvaise chose, ça dépend de quoi, mais l'oubli est nécessaire dans la constitution des sociétés. Donc c'est un couple qui alterne entre les deux, mémoire et oubli. Le deuxième point, c'était la question de notre ami sur la modernité. Je pense qu'on le prend comme un concept que l'on n'interroge pas. Si un ami Kofi a tout à l'heure évoqué une critique de la modernité, et peut-être que l'un de nos travaux, c'est de nous poser la question de savoir quel type de modernité on veut, que mettons-nous dedans, et quelle potentialité ça actualise chez nous. Donc, peut-être que la modernité, c'est juste actualiser au mieux ces potentialités. Et qu'on peut être moderne sans être occidental, mais est-ce que c'est fondamentalement une téléologie obligée? Donc là aussi, c'est un concept que l'on utilise comme acquis, et peut-être qu'il y a eu des travaux sur des modalités alternatives, etc., etc. Mais peut-être que la question pour nous, c'est de savoir quel régime d'historicité on produit. On est toujours en train de se poser la question de savoir, est-ce que nous habitons les régimes d'historicité qui ont déjà été produits? Nous ne nous posons pas la question de savoir, est-ce qu'on peut actualiser le régime d'historicité que nous produisons nous-mêmes?
Et surtout l'opposition entre la modernité forcément et la tradition, qui n'est pas une opposition qui est nécessairement nécessaire, juste à questionner, je suis complètement d'accord. Merci Farid. Et sur ce, je pense qu'on va conclure ce panel et vous demander d'applaudir mes deux panélistes. Plus de temps, justement, pour prendre plus de questions. Merci beaucoup de nous avoir donné ce temps de parole et ce moment de réflexion.
Non, c'était vraiment extraordinaire et c'était vraiment très intéressant de les entendre toutes les deux, en particulier avec toi, Cynthia. Je pense que ça alimente aussi beaucoup toutes les conversations qui vont émerger tout au long du symposium, et en particulier celle qu'on va avoir sur la responsabilité de l'hospitalité aussi, quand on va dans la continuité de cette idée du déplacement et de la manière dont les populations sont extraites, sorties. Et voilà, donc merci beaucoup à toutes les trois. Je me permets de vous retenir encore un peu, on va faire une vraie pause, mais vraiment une pause. Mais tout au long de ce symposium, on a un axe qui vient comme une ombrelle autour des différentes journées. C'est l'axe sur les liens intangibles. Donc je vais vous l'introduire parce que tout à l'heure, on va se retrouver dans un moment qui ne nécessitera pas d'introduction et pas forcément de discours. D'accord ? Donc, les liens intangibles, pour nous, en tout cas, jouent un rôle crucial dans la dynamique sociale et culturelle des lieux. Au-delà des infrastructures physiques, ces liens sont tissés à travers les récits de mémoire collective, les pratiques culturelles et les interactions quotidiennes. Ils révèlent une solidarité communautaire à travers des événements sociaux, la transmission orale du patrimoine culturel et la créativité artistique qui façonne l'identité urbaine. Au Sénégal, le rapport entre l'humain et la présence non visible trouve un écho particulier dans l'histoire de la création de la ville de Dakar par les communautés des villes. Les cosmogonies sont constamment réactivées au quotidien pour diverses formes de négociation et de transactions. À maintes reprises, la sacralité des lieux a été un oubli pour la préservation des sites naturels. Donc cet axe nous permet d'approfondir nos liens à l'histoire des formes de résistance contre toute forme de domination qui enrichissent le tissu social. Tout de suite maintenant, on a une longue pause d'à peu près 1 heure. Le programme de Nora va commencer un peu plus tard et on est vraiment très heureuse qu'elle vienne présenter son travail. Elle travaille avec un groupe de femmes qui sont issues de l'école des sables et qui nous viennent de Toubab Dialaw. Mam Germaine Akoni, elle a dû aller se reposer, nous a beaucoup accompagnés pour ça. Nora travaille avec elle depuis plusieurs années et elles ont particulièrement... Elles ont en particulier travaillé ensemble sur un projet qui s'appelle Not Waiting, qui a été présenté au HKV et qui a été l'objet de la résidence de Nora à Rome en 2022, je crois, si je me trompe pas. Voilà. Du coup, normalement, le programme de Nora commence à 18h. Ça laisse à tout le monde le temps d'aller faire un vrai bref. En bas, il y a une pause café avec des rafraîchissements et des choses vraiment l'air à grignoter. Mais si vous avez envie, pour ceux qui veulent retourner à l'hôtel, se poser vraiment avant de revenir à 18h, vous le pouvez. Et sinon, vous restez avec nous dans le jardin. Donc, je vous présente la performance de Nora. Et puis ensuite, vous êtes libre. Donc, dans sa performance, Nora Chikomire interroge la notion de lieu et de déplacement en les réinventant comme un état plutôt qu'une réalité physique. En dialoguant avec des traditions portées par des femmes issues de la communauté libre de Toubab Dialaw, elle propose un déplacement accueillant où la continuité des cultures, des langues et des transmissions devient une responsabilité commune, rejetant les cadres occidentaux de légitimité, certificats, passeports, diplômes. Elle envisage une utopie où le corps et le cœur définissent le lieu à travers une esthétique qui s'inspire de l'animisme et d'une pensée radicale. Nora invite à reconsidérer le rapport entre ancrage, déplacement et humanité partagée. Ce sera dans la cour, juste tout à fait à gauche du restaurant. Il n'y aura pas de chaises, sauf pour les personnes qui en ont vraiment besoin, mais elle préfère que les gens expérimentent ce moment en mouvement. Merci. Une dernière chose, les personnes qui se sont garées à côté du restaurant, on va vous demander de déplacer vos voitures. Voilà, ça c'était le truc pas sympa, mais c'est pour permettre aux choses de se passer comme